Okay, so picking up where we left off from yesterday. If you remember yesterday, we talked about the tensions that existed between workers and owners and how labor in America let's how labor in America sort of became associated with these weird radical ideas coming from Europe politically. And that was largely because in Europe, the big labor organizations and unions were all run by Marxists. And they were very angry and militant and really they weren't about making people's lives better in the long run. What they wanted was to overthrow governments. There was a crackdown on these groups in 1848. And many of those leaders who were not arrested or executed fled to America. Now, there weren't many of them in the great scheme of things regarding the number of immigrants who were coming to America, but there were a significant number. And these people deliberately made their way into or began labor unions. Remember that a union is just a group of workers who are all in the same industry who join together in order to negotiate. And there were real problems in America with workers regarding working conditions, pay, um, hours, and even children having to work. And these were things that legitimately workers needed fixed and addressed. The problem is that the association with political radicalism in Europe and this influx of these anarchist Marxists um, after the failed revolutions of 1848 allowed American business owners to redirect the problem from what really needed to be fixed to the sort of boogeyman of communism. And that's not to say that there wasn't a threat, but the Marxist threat was being used to overshadow what legitimately needed to be fixed. The irony of this is that the more that owners did this, the more that Marxism caught on with workers because they genuinely saw it as the only opportunity that they had to better their conditions. And we'll talk more about that later. But what we're going to do right now is we're going to look at how American labor changed after the Civil War. So remember, in 1842, unions were legalized in the case of Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Hunt. And they were perfectly fine provided that they legally organized themselves and that they legally engaged in activities. The first major nationwide union, the union that encompassed the entire country, was called the National Labor Union. It lasted only about 7 years, right after the Civil War. It was open to everybody. Now, this is problematic because remember, when we had first started talking about unions, I had said that the definition I want you to remember is that there are groups of workers in the same industry. This is important because you need different unions to represent different ideas. If you have a lead miner in southwestern Wisconsin, he is not going to have the same interests and needs that a bricklayer will in New York City or a cabinet maker will in Philadelphia. There are very different skill sets involved, and they don't necessarily have the same goals. Now, the other problem with the National Labor Union, so it letting everybody in was one problem, and there wasn't a lot of agreement on how to go forward with this. The other real problem is that they were very restrictive. Only white males were allowed to be in the union, and this limited the labor pool quite substantially. There were some minor successes that they were able to achieve. The real problem with the National Labor Union is that they were sort of like an example of what it was that legitimately concerned people. Anarchists and Marxists got involved in the leadership of the union, and they moved the union's mission away from trying to make life better for workers to trying to push for political change and advanced Marxism. This caused them to fall apart in 1873. Now, it's truly an ill wind that blows nobody any good, and there was a big positive outcome from the National Labor Union. One outcome that was good is the realization that it was possible to create big labor organizations. The other very good outcome was the development of the Knights of Labor. Now, if you're in a situation where people think that you're a secret organization, that you're part of a vast conspiracy, orchestrated by some shadow group of really sketchy sus people, Illuminati or whatever you want to call it, doing things like having secret meetings, being all hush hush about what the union's about, making a logo that looks like whatever the heck this thing is. Holy buckets, look at that thing. That's just weird. And did all sorts of strange stuff written, AK the Ninth, whatever the heck that is. Weird triangles, pentagrams. That is the most perfect government in which an injury to one is the concern of all. Fraternum North America. This weird disproportionate triangle over what? Okay, I'm just saying that, like, if I'm the head of an organization and like a guy comes in with, hey, I think we should have a logo that looks like this. This logo screams weird conspiracy, secret society stuff. Stay away. Just saying. The Knights of Labor, getting back to my original point before I went off on a tangent. What a surprise about that, by the way. Um, the Knights of Labor were chartered and organized in 1869. And what made them very different was their approach to labor problems. So, to begin with, the first thing to understand, the Knights of Labor were actually officially authorized and chartered through a church, in this particular case, the Roman Catholic Church in America. Workers had actually contacted the bishops and leaders of the Catholic Church, which eventually got itself all the way up to the Pope in Rome, asking for permission to start a labor union. And to understand why they had to do this religiously, it's really important to understand that the Catholic Church is strongly opposed to Marxism in any form whatsoever. And they got permission provided they did some very specific things. And so what I have here is a list of the basically 8 main things that the Knights of Labor were engaged in or after. They were a big, very successful union. At their peak in the 1880s, they had nearly 1 million members across the country. And like I said, they approached things differently. Number one, their big advocacy, their big push was not, first and foremost, was not even for like work change. It was the idea that to best help everybody who was a laborer or a worker meant that you had to educate them and you had to basically bring them up to a level where they were, for lack of a better word, civilized, cultured, refined, polite. If you could have the same manners, behaviors, education as the people who ran your companies, they were more likely to see you as an equal. Second thing, the complete rejection of Marxism and anarchism of any kind whatsoever. This is an important one because ultimately this is what's going to destroy the Knights of Labor. Third, republicanism. This has nothing to do with politics. What republicanism refers to is the idea that the Knights of Labor, they didn't do like the National Labor Union and just like lump everybody together. The Knights of Labor had separate local like chapters. Those chapters were divided up by occupation and industry. So there would be like one group of people who were carpenters, and one people who were bricklayers, and one people who were ditch diggers, and one people, group of people who were, say, um, grocery store workers. Each of these people had separate organizations within the Knights of Labor. Those separate groups elected representatives who then went to the regional meetings to vote for their people. This is how it was Republican. It was set up with the idea of elected representation to speak on behalf of each of the individual or different groups within the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor argued for the 8-hour workday. This, and I will tell you this right now, this is something I'm going to specifically ask you on a test. This is one common theme among every union across the country, no matter who they were, what they did, who they represented, even the nutso ones. The 8-hour workday. And as we'll talk about, and as you read a little bit about in your textbook, Samuel Gompers, who was the head of the most successful labor organization in American history, the American Federation of Labor, argued the 8-hour split, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of relaxation, 8 hours of sleep. That's what people wanted and needed. They argued for better working conditions. Hey, let's not be in an environment where a machine may rip an arm off. And if it does, there needs to be something set up to help the worker who gets injured. An end to child and prison labor. We already talked about the child labor. Prison labor was another one. You will still see this to an extent. Like, sometimes you're driving along the highway and you look out of the car and there's like a group of guys who are all dressed in like orange or blue jumpsuits or something. And they got little grab nabbers or picker upper things. And there's a big bus that they come out of. They're picking up garbage because they're prisoners. And this is community service to help pay the debt that they owe society for what they did. In the South, this was a really common thing to have prisoners build roads, especially in really rural areas. The problem is that particularly in the South, but in some cases in the North, you had prison wardens, the guys who were in charge of the prison, renting out prisoners at really low rates to factories or to jobs or to whatever. And they would pocket that money and they would just get basically free labor for these organizations. It makes it really hard to compete as a worker when your company can just go basically rent prisoners for next to nothing. Now, how would this be an advantage? We'll look at it this way. If you had a warden or a prison with 100 prisoners that he rented out, even at a penny a day each, that guy was getting $1 a day. And over a 6-day week, that's $6 extra in his pocket that cost him nothing and he did nothing. And back then, $6 would have been a whole heap of money. $6 a week would have been more than enough to pay your rent, provide for food, and probably basic necessities, and even have a little something extra to spend. And if that guy was already making $3 or $4 a week, he was suddenly rolling in the cash. The support of cooperatives. This may not sound familiar, but a cooperative is a business where the employees are the owners. We have lots of them around today. And in fact, Cooperatives are generally regarded as the best companies to work for because the employees realize that their um, their commitment to the company and the company's success benefits them too. The, a great example of a cooperative that I can think of right off the bat is Quick Trip is a form of a cooperative. When you get a job at Quick Trip, you get profit sharing, which means that you're partly owning that company. Okay, Woodman's Grocery Store is another one. These companies, their employees will work harder because they're the owners of the company. And when the company succeeds, they succeed. If you're interested at all for extra credit, you may get a list of up to 50 United States cooperatives. Doesn't have to be in Wisconsin, across the United States. 50 businesses that are employee owned. You will be surprised the number of them that you will find. And for every 10 you come up with, I will give you 1 point of extra credit. All you have to do is give me a list. It doesn't have to have explanations, just give me a list. The point of this being is that I want you to be able to see how many companies there are that actually do this and realize that a lot of them are companies you didn't realize were like that. And those companies tend to do better than other ones. Last but not least, the Knights of Labor supported an income tax. And the idea behind this basically was an issue of equity. That if you, that there's some degree of responsibility everybody should have to pay to support everybody else. And the more money you made, the more responsibility you should have on that level. Again, this organization was chartered by the Catholic Church. They were, now what's unusual about them is that they were open to like pretty much any occupation. It didn't matter what ethnic background or race you were. It didn't matter what religious background you were. Yes, they were Catholic, but they were open to people who of any religion. And they were open to both men and women. Now, what is also interesting is they were also open to a category of people they called producers. And this was unique among labor unions. If you were a farmer, they would let you into the Knights of Labor. Why? Well, you work on your farm. Therefore, you're an employee. You're self employed, but you're still an employee. If you owned a small business where you worked in your business alongside your employees, you were technically an employee too. They would let you in. When the National Labor Union fell apart, the Knights of Labor really benefit from this. They were an amazing dynamic force. What killed them, let me finish up with this part here. The Knights of Labor were really successful, especially against railroads, in utilizing a tactic called a strike. A strike is basically where workers refuse to do their job until certain demands are met. The Knights of Labor was really effective in getting change made in the big railroad industries. And we'll talk about this probably in the next day or two. The railroads really had some major problems, quite frankly, self inflicted problems, by the way. What killed the Knights of Labor was how successful they were. The Knights of Labor began attracting people away from the Marxist unions. And the Marxists began to view the Knights of Labor as a direct threat. Now, it also is the fact that most of the Marxists were actually atheists, and they wanted to wipe out any influence of Christianity in general, Catholics in specific. The Marxists deliberately involved themselves in the Knights of Labor and worked to destroy them from within. The Marxists also did a great job of connecting the Knights of Labor with some horrible, violent strikes that occurred in the 1880s. And even though the knights themselves were not involved with it, the Marxists who controlled a lot of the news publishing, not big newspapers, small independent newspapers, really convinced people that the Knights of Labor were, if not directly behind the violence, really supportive of it. And eventually, the Knights just fell apart because of this. By the way, just one last little point here. Um, a lot of the ideas that we're talking about here. So we talked about capitalism, which is the idea of like free market economics, and then you talk about like um, Marxism, which is total command market. Economically speaking, this falls under a third category. It's relatively obscure. I just bring it up because it's kind of an interesting concept. It's called distributivism. And it's not full on capitalism, but it is by no means Marxism. Distributivism is the idea that employees need to be more involved and that things need to be local and that you should support local businesses, local organizations. Now, sometimes you can't help but support big ones, but if at all possible, you should support the little guys, the local peeps, not the big box store, say, for example. Distributivism would be the idea of if you need some clothes, instead of going to Kohl's, you go to like a small local shop that sells clothes. Yes, you'll pay a little bit more, but you're going to get better service and it'll benefit the community more directly. That's the idea behind distributivism, at least. Okay, this is where we're going to end off today. And we'll talk tomorrow about the AFL and Samuel Gompers. Peace and love.